Oh,
Hi, this is David Hopper with 360degreesound.com. I'm here with Jordan Bassett, author of the excellent new book, Here's Little Richard, 33 and a third series, which is available on Bloomsbury Academic. Should be available wherever books are sold, and we'll get right into it. Thanks for joining us, Jordan. Um,
hey, thank you.
the the first sentence of the prologue of this book reads, "Little Richard was the most significant cultural figure of the 20th century." That's a bold statement, but I think anyone who reads your book will be inclined to agree.
Oh,
Why, in a
right.
nutshell, was Little Richard the most significant cultural figure?
Well, it's amazing to hear you say that. I really appreciate it. I mean, that's pretty much the ideal response, right? Because I wanted it to be like you read that first sentence and you think, what, really? And then by the end of it, you kind of find it hard to disagree. That was the idea, really. Um, because I did catch myself before I hit send, and I thought, can I really make that statement? But I think ultimately, if you think that rock and roll music in the 1950s was the most significant musical and cultural movement of the 20th century, in that it wasn't just about music, it was about, you know, film, fashion, it was about basically the invention of the teenager as a concept. It was about the idea of music being rebellious and countercultural, and that it was a precursor to punk, to everything that followed, to hip hop. And you think that Little Richard invented rock and roll music, which I do, then you have to say he's the most important figure of the most important movement. So hopefully by the end of this book, you've been convinced and you see it as self-evident. But yeah, it did give me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah. What one of you cite, I think, three main influences of Little Richard. I believe it was Fats Domino, Sister Rosetta Thorpe, and Louis Jordan. Um,
Yeah.
I, I want to talk a little about Louis Jordan, who had a remarkable run of hits in the 40s and early 50s, but as you write, seems to be a bit underappreciated today. Yeah, talk some about the impact Louis Jordan and the jump blues had on Little Richard and the development of rock and roll.
Yeah, so jump blues was kind of the stopgap between jazz and blues and rock and roll music. It was the period in which all these different influences, like whether it's gospel or blues or swing, kind of came together and invented something new. And jump blues, in a lot of cases, was essentially big band music. But in the wartime era, the pre-war era, into the actual wartime era, um, a lot of these guys couldn't afford to maintain big bands, so they slimmed these groups down from 20 something, say, to in a lot of cases like half a dozen people. Louis Jordan's band were called the Timpani Five, although actually the numbers often change depending on who was playing with him. But that was kind of the consistent thing. And so it's kind of an accident. It was one of those beautiful, brilliant musical, cultural accidents that they, by financial necessity, had to slim down these groups. And the sound itself came out as sort of faster and leaner, and it kind of sounded more like what we would now call rock and roll music. But Louis Jordan was really like the king of the jump blues era. He was one of the most successful artists, period, of the 1940s, certainly in the States. He had something, the actual numbers are in the book, but like he had something like 46 top 50 hits between 1942 and 1951. 18 of those went to number one. Um, he is still, and I talk about this in the book, he is still officially the sixth most popular R&B artist of all time. And this is on the Billboard R&B
Mm.
charts. Although those figures were last updated in 2016, and I spoke to a researcher the record research company that provides these figures, and he said, "Yeah, like we haven't updated those figures since 2016. I'm sure that Drake must have overtaken him by now because Drake
Yeah.
was kind of on his heels back then." And I think that's amazing. Like, wow, how incredible to hear
Yeah.
Louis Jordan's name next to Drake's name. But that's kind of what that's an indication of what a modern figure Louis Jordan was. Why has he been kind of written out of music history? Because no one really talks about Louis Jordan anymore, but they should do, in my opinion. And I think part of it is that he was a black musician, and just like Little Richard would be a decade later, he didn't receive the respect and credit that he should have done for that reason, unfortunately. But I also think part of it is to do with the music he made. His music was so eclectic. He did swing, he did jazz, he did proto rock and roll. Um, in some way, in one case, he even did kind of like proto rap. He had a song called "Beware," which people should look up. It's amazing and so ahead of its time. And I think that he's kind of slipped through the gaps of like critical analysis. So it's like if you write a book about the history of jazz, Louis Jordan will be a kind of a figure in it, but not the figure. The same with the history of rock and roll, the same with the history of swing, so it goes on. He was kind of too eclectic for his own good. So I think it's high time for him to be reappraised, because I always think about him. It's like, it kind of counted against him in the long run that he was so eclectic, but now artists are actively encouraged to be eclectic
Mm,
because then that makes them successful on the streaming services.
mm,
So it's like Louis Jordan would have cleaned up in 2024, I think.
yeah.
But in terms of what an influence he was on Little Richard, there's a song called Caledonia, which is the only, or it was the first secular song that Little Richard, who grew up on gospel, it was the first secular song that he performed in public, um, with a sort of traveling vaudeville show. And if you listen to this song, it's from 1945, but it sounds like it could almost be a Little Richard song, apart from it's more obviously rooted in blues, but it's got this incredible chorus where he kind of yelps the words Caledonia, Caledonia, what makes your big head so hot? Map. Which is it's sort of brilliant nonsense, delivered in this yelped kind of vocal style, um, which is exactly what Little Richard would do 10 years later with Tutti Frutti. So yeah, Louis Jordan, an absolutely incredible, pivotal figure, who, similarly to Little Richard, if you take him out of the story of popular music in the 20th century, the whole thing starts to fall apart a bit. And he's well overdue his credit, I think, Louis.
Mm, yeah, certainly. Yeah, you mentioned Tutti Frutti. That brings me to my next question. That was Little Richard's first commercial success and first single and first song on the album. Here's Little Richard. So some of our readers and viewers may not know the backstory of that song. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the genesis of it and the lyric changes that had to be made.
Yeah, I can fill that one in. That's a fun story. So,
Yeah.
um, so Little Richard records this audition tape. He's living in Macon, Georgia, which is about an hour and a half out of Atlanta, and he's working as a dishwasher, and he gets talking to Lloyd Price, who's playing at the Macon Auditorium. So Lloyd Price had a big hit in 1952, the big hit of 1952, really, in terms of R&B with Lordy Miss Claudie. And he says, like, I want a record deal. Like, what can I do? And Lloyd Price says, mail an audition tape to Art Rupert Specialty Records, based in LA. So Richard does that. He records some like scratchy, ratty audition tape, and he sends it off. Doesn't hear anything back. He spends a year pestering the label, and eventually Art Rupert listens to this tape, and he goes, "Yeah, okay, there's something in this." So he sets up a session at the J&M recording studio in New Orleans, and sends this kind of rookie producer, Bumps Blackwell, who sadly died in the 80s. So I spoke instead to his daughter, Kelly Lee, who's an amazing storyteller, and is really kind of, carrying the flag for her father's legacy. So she's in the book. And they've got these crack musicians there, these amazing New Orleans musicians who backed Fats Domino, really like the top guys in their game. But weirdly, like, it's just not happening. they're kind of recording these nice but not particularly spectacular R&B songs, kind of slow numbers. So they take a break and they go to the Dewdrop Inn, which is kind of like a drag bar in New Orleans, a place that, maybe we don't think of these places as being in the South in the 50s, but I mean, really, Richard was fostered by an incredible queer scene, both there and in his hometown of Macon. They're just screwing about. Richard gets on the piano and he starts banging out this filthy song. And it's just like for his mates. He said that he was playing it to crack the crows up. That was his description of it. Bumps Blackwell just can't believe what he's hearing. I mean, this thing is absolutely electrifying. And he says, Richard, I don't know what that is, but we need to get back to the studio now and record that immediately because that song's a hit. I mean, we're going to have to change the lyrics because we can't record that. And the original lyrics are tutti frutti, good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. Just grease it, make it easy. It's a song about anal sex. It's a song about lubrication and anal sex. And so they rope in a songwriter called Dorothy LaBostrie to clean up the lyrics. And the official story is that she cleans up the lyrics in 15 minutes and kind of makes it about a gal named, say, Daisy and a gal named Sue, and kind of makes it more wholesome, apple pie, American 50s. She reckons she did a lot more than that. That's a whole other story, which I also go into in the book. But Richard didn't even want to sing the song in front of Dorothy LaBostrie because she was such a nice lady and he was so embarrassed about singing this song. But they do it with 15 minutes on the clock in the studio, right at the end of the session. Richard sounds kind of hoarse in it. It's because he's been singing all day. I always think it's comparable to, I didn't have time to squeeze this into the book, but I always think it's comparable to John Lennon doing Twist and Shout at the end of a 12-hour recording session when he was full of cold. It's like this kind of, it lends this kind of raucousness to the song. They release it and it just absolutely exploded. It was like all the DJs wanted to play this song because it just had this kind of strange power to it, which was, even though it had been cleaned up, it still sounded kind of rebellious and countercultural and rooted in this, although people maybe didn't quite realize it, it had this weird kind of raw power that was rooted in the countercultural queer scene that had come out of.
Yeah, certainly. Let's see here. Little Richard, of course, had a flamboyant, gender-bending appearance with the heavy makeup and pompadour. I thought it was an interesting part of the book when you wrote about how it was so, I guess, outrageous at the time and in the 50s that it's like he wasn't taken seriously, like his over-the-top look was accepted by these conservative white audiences. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that. So was that kind of by design, like Little Richard knew that based on his appearance he'd have a better chance of breaking in? Or?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, he even said that outright because he was an incredibly emotionally intelligent person, Richard. He didn't have the opportunity to be educated academically or in a traditional way, but he was an unbelievably intelligent, emotionally intelligent person, and he read this situation. He, as a queer black man living in the South in the 1950s, he was in danger every single day of his life, and yet you look at the way he lived and you think, well, how the hell did he get away with this? There's a great book called American Nightmare: The History of Jim Crow, by an author called Gerald Packard, who he basically lists all the alleged crimes that a black person could commit in the 1950s in the South, that could bring violence upon them. And he says basically, these transgressions would be like wearing clothes that are too flamboyant, being too flashy with your money, like looking appealing to a white woman. And he's like, Little Richard would wear these crazy outfits. He would dress up as the Pope. He was a drag queen. He would pull up to venues in Cadillacs. He would have cash, loose notes stuffed into the trunk of these Cadillacs. He's at one gig, at kind of the height of his fame. The car got mobbed and there were people hanging onto the back of the car, fans hanging onto the back of the car. It was amazing what he did. And he achieved it because he was so emotionally intelligent by kind of making himself into a living cartoon. He amped up the gender bending thing, he amped up the makeup so that, exactly as you say, people didn't quite take him seriously enough to realize just how transgressive it was, what he was doing. People got up in arms about Elvis blurring the racial lines in terms of mixing black and white music, which at the time was, of course, was very segregated. People got up in arms about rock and roll music in general. The White Citizens Council of Alabama put out this statement saying, we need to stop rock and roll music because it's bringing the people of two races together. But no one got wound up about Little Richard. And you think, how? And I think the answer is that no one even knew what the hell they were looking at. They just thought he was sort of a wild entertainer. They didn't. I think people just couldn't compute what he was. They couldn't understand it in order to get annoyed by it. He was kind of like, he blinded people. He blinded people with his absolute brilliance. And so that was how he managed to slip into the mainstream, this incredibly transgressive figure who would still be transgressive now. I'm really like amazed by this, that he would still, if Little Richard came out now at the start of his career, he would still be a transgressive figure. And so it sort of boggles your mind that he could have done it in the 50s, but I think that's exactly how he did it, by kind of dazzling people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. You got some big names to comment about Little Richard in the book, including Elton John, Dave Grohl, and Joan Jett. What if you could kind of discuss their reverence for Little Richard and what their perspectives brought to the book?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the thing that I wanted to really do with this book was to, I mean, the figures that we're talking about, Elton John, Dave Grohl, Joan Jett, as you said, Tom Jones is in there, disco queen Candy Staton, the king of disco, Nile Rodgers. What I wanted was to have these kind of like they're almost like establishment figures, these people, aren't they? Right? They're kind of like generational figures. Like everyone basically knows who these people are, or at least knows their songs. And the terrible thing about Richard's story is that, as I alluded to earlier, he's never had the credit he was due. He invented rock and roll music, like we're sitting here having this conversation, and we probably wouldn't even be here having this conversation if Little Richard hadn't existed. Not just because I wrote a book about him, but because your website wouldn't exist, right? It would be nothing. I worked at NME. NME would have nothing to talk about because none of it would have happened if it wasn't for him, in my opinion. Um, and yet he never got the credit he was due, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. But I really wanted to have these kind of like kings and queens of rock and pop music talking about him like a deity, because I think that gives him the credit he was due. He was the king and queen of rock and roll, as he was fond of saying. And I wanted him to have that I wanted the book to have a certain stateliness, if I can say that, to it, which I hope is lent that by the people who um who uh who speak for the book. Because there's lots of younger artists who are into, or newer artists who are into Little Richard, like Honey Dijon's spoken about him, Chance the Rapper's spoken about him, Lil Nas X dressed up as him for Halloween. And it would have been really cool to speak to those people, but I kind of wanted to, I think that's a sort of different project. Like I wanted it to be like household names in there, basically, because it's like that's what he deserves. He deserves to be there with those household names that everyone knows. And I think by speaking to those kinds of people, you emphasize just his absolute importance,
Mm-hmm. Well, for sure. Yeah, so here's Little Richard is I believe just 12 tracks in less than 29 minutes, but it's all killer, no filler. Do you have
Yeah,
a
that's
favorite
right.
do you have a favorite track on the album?
Yeah, my favorite track is True Fire Mama.
Okay.
which is kind of an album track.
Yeah.
It's like a deep cut on that album. So that it's a weird one because Richard mostly recorded his 50 stuff with Specialty Records with the band I mentioned earlier, which was a bit of a revolving cast, but it was basically the J&M recording studio house band. It's kind of these amazing guys like Earl Palmer, Frank Fields, Red Tyler, these kind of like creme de la creme musicians who were totally at the forefront of segueing R&B into rock and roll. But he also had his live band, the Upsetters. Guys like Charles Connor, who sadly passed a couple of years ago while I was writing the book, actually. And they were a bit wilder and a bit more raucous. And Richard always wanted, even though he had these creme de la creme musicians, he always wanted to record with the Upsetters because they were like his guys. And the label was always resistant to that because they wanted it tighter. And the weird thing about True Fine Mama is that it's not recorded with any of those guys. I mean, it's recorded with just some dudes that he picked up in New Orleans. There's a guy who was in Guitar Slim's band, but like really, how did he meet these guys? There's no record of that. I like to think he just went for a night out and he just like rolled. I think he went for a night out the night before the session and just rolled into the studio with these dudes. But he never recorded with this band again. He had one session with this band. And it's kind of amazing because they really split the difference between the kind of polished sound of the J&M band and the kind of the raucousness and the rawness of the Upsetters. And it's a romantic song, but it's kind of got this edge to it, and it's got this like looseness to it, this kind of control tight looseness to it. I know that's a contradiction, but that's what the song is. That's what's so extraordinary about it. It's this kind of contained chaos that's kind of like unlike anything else he did. And it's very kind of like swooning and romantic, but it's got a real edge to it. I mean, I could just listen to that song
Mhm.
like all day. Sometimes when I'm listening to Spotify and you've got stuff queued and it runs out, Spotify just plays me that song because he'll listen to that
Yeah,
song.
right. Algorithm does,
Algorithm got me.
Uh, yeah. As you said, much of Here's Little Richard was recorded with the crack band at J&M Studio in New Orleans, which was owned and operated by the legendary recording engineer Cosimo Matassa, I believe is how you pronounce it.
Yes,
But
I
yeah,
think so.
they were very limited in what they could do in the studio. This was in the 50s before overdubbing and
Yeah.
before stereo recordings were really widely used in rock music. So, wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Matassa and producer Bumps Blackwell were able to do so much with so little when recording Here's Little Richard.
Yeah, well, that's the extraordinary thing about it. I mean, I kind of think that that's partly why the song sounds timeless because it essentially is just some guys playing in a room. It's like
Mhm.
you listen to songs from the 80s, maybe, and it's like they might be great songs, but they kind of have that slightly naff, like shiny 80s production. And you
Yeah.
think, oh, man, I'd love to hear a version of this song that doesn't have that. And Richard's got an album from the 80s called Lifetime Friend, which is exactly like that. But I think that's partly why it's so timeless because it is just some guys playing in a room. But yeah, I mean, Bumps Blackwell was really, really an ingenious guy. Like even Cosmo Tassa basically described his own studio as three microphones and some juggling. Which is quite an amazing thing to say about your own place. And it was just this ramshackle little place at the back of his family's sort of general store. They sold waffle irons and fridges in this place, and it was just it's now a laundrette. I mean, you'd never even know it. All there is like a plaque there. I mean, and then there are some pictures. But it's quite amazing, really. But yeah, a lot of it's to do with Bumps Blackwell was a very, very ingenious producer. So he would do things like, you know, the drums would be too loud. So the Earl Palmer would be sat out in the hallway. He would be sat in a different room with the door open so it didn't bleed too much into the mix. He would have to position the saxophonist in one place and Richard in the other to make sure that the sounds didn't bleed together. You'd have to get him to do a take. He'd go and listen to it and go, no, the sax player's in the wrong place. And he was basically just doing it all by sight and sound. I mean, they would run through like 60 to 70 takes of a track, which is amazing because it sounds so raucous and raw. And you think, well, how the hell did they manage to keep that energy up? But they kept the energy up because I think, and you read a lot of the testimonials as well. It was Richard. Richard just brought this insane amount of energy. Even Art Rube, who the specialty label boss who discovered Richard, I mean, he could be really exasperated with Richard. They had a weird relationship. It was kind of like a father and son thing. But even Art Rube, I had to say, Richard like brought a lot out of it. Like he worked hard. He worked so hard that he brought these incredible performances out of people. So I think it was kind of like the perfect mix of Art Root was a kind of super methodical, steely guy who would create these very contained situations. Bumps Blackwell was an unbelievably ingenious producer who could kind of read a situation and think on his feet, because it's the spontaneity of it. And Richard had this crazy amount of energy, and these guys were just crack musicians. So you put that all together, and it just makes absolute magic. But when you look at the stuff that these guys were using, like Bumps Blackwell was using an Ampex 3000 console, which is, I mean, honestly, it's from the 1950s. It looks like something from the 1850s. It's just a fiddly little thing with these little dials on it, and then you listen to it, and it's like the thing explodes from the speakers. And I think there's just something incredibly beautiful about that.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, just had a couple more. Yeah, Little Richard famously had the Beatles open for him at the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany,
Yeah.
for a number of shows in 1962. It got me thinking about Jerry Lee Lewis's Live at the Star Club album, which, in my opinion,
Yeah.
is one of the greatest live records ever.
Great.
It's too bad that those Little Richard gigs weren't recorded, at least not to my knowledge. But it got me
Fine.
thinking: are there any good Little Richard live albums that you recommend? He was such an electric performer.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of like crazy stuff kicking around. I mean, there's one. I should look this up actually. I always keep an eye on like Spotify for Little Richard, because sometimes stuff just pops up and you think, how did that? What is that? Like, why is that? And there's one called Bakuda Rock and Roll from '56, which is pretty cool. It's kind of cool to catch him in his '60s era, kind of post Beatles. He's kind of got a bit more of a the sound's a bit more beefed up. It's a bit more of a it's kind of more rubbery sound, than it's like a sort of, yeah, it's like he's taken the kind of Merseybeat sound and worked it into his thing. But I mean, there is an LP that you can pick up really cheap on Discogs called the Specialty Records. No, sorry, it's called the Little Richard Story, and it's like a real nasty budget thing. It was one of the first LPs I ever bought about 10 or 15 years ago.
Hmm.
It's got this amazing photo of Richard like covered in glitter, sat at the piano. It's like I think the picture, it's a real mismatch thing. It's one of these mismatch things, and I think the picture's actually taken from a TV show he did. And I played this thing to death in my 20s, which was when I started to get really obsessed with Richard. And I was disappointed because I thought there were going to be like the specialty recordings on this thing, which I bought for about £2. And they're kind of these hoary live tracks from really, like, in a way, when he was past his prime. But there's a kind of raucousness and wildness and raggedness to them, which is amazing to hear. And I got rid of that record when I was tied in. I thought I sort of, once I got much more into collecting vinyl in the last 5 years or so, and I did that thing where you think, oh, I've outgrown this ratty record that I bought for £2 when I was 24. I'll get rid of it, and
Yeah,
I've always regretted it. So don't throw out your crappy old vinyl. That's
yeah,
what I tell. Part of
for
your
sure.
story.
Yeah. But yeah, finally, I guess what do you think is the main legacy of here's Little Richard? I mean, here we are over 65 years later, and it still
Yeah.
just sounds so great and fresh, and like you said, it could and he'd be transgressive and controversial even today probably. But I guess if you could sum it up, like what you think the legacy of that particular record is.
Well, I think it's really cool that, like I said earlier, Lil Nas X paid tribute to Little Richard and dressed up as him for Halloween. And, I know that some people get a bit annoyed about Lil Nas X and find the videos he does and stuff like a bit mannered. But I think, there you've got an artist who's winding people up and, doing transgressive things with his art. I mean, that there's a perfect through line there. I say in the book that WAP is kind of like the tutti frutti of its day. I think that Richard gave artists the right to break down barriers and do wild things, because it's like Richard never really got tamed. Elvis got tamed. Elvis went into the army and got tamed and made the movies and kind of assimilated into like polite mainstream culture. Richard never did. Richard, he quit rock and roll in the 50s, in 57 at the height of his fame to go back to the church. He was back on the road in the 60s, dressed up as the Pope, performing Tutti Frutti in England. He was in the 70s. He was making amazing. He's got an incredible album from 1970 called The Real Thing, which has been kind of forgotten about, but it's kind of this amazing kind of like swampy Southern rock thing. I mean, and he was always out of control. His appearance got wilder. He got camper. He got more transgressive into the 70s. And I think that is his ultimate legacy. I think he's given. I mean, aside from the fact that the Beatles always paid tribute to him, and there's a direct through line from Little Richard to the Beatles to David Bowie to Prince to all of contemporary pop music. And if you take Richard out, the whole thing falls apart. Aside from that, I think his big legacy is that he was just always himself, for better or worse, and in some cases worse. He was always himself. And I think if you can take one thing from his story, I would hope, and I think that would be it.
Great. Well, also, this was fascinating. Thank you so much, Jordan. And everyone, if you'd like to learn more, please pick up his book, 33 and a Third. Here's Little Richard in bookstores now. So
Thank you so
thanks
much for your
again,
time.
Jordan. Take
That was
care.
great.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye now.